Mediumship and its physical, mental, and spiritual conditions. In this lecture, we take upon the consideration of the most important subject, that of mediumship. To enable us to do the matter as much justice as possible, we have decided to divide this subject into two sections, dealing with mediumship in this lecture regard to its physiological, mental, and spiritual conditions in the individual, while in the next lecture, we shall deal with its development and dangers and some other matters of importance, by which we hope to put you in possession of tolerably clear but necessarily condensed statements of laws and philosophies of mediumship. There are many people who consider that mediumship is the greatest possible blessing that can come to them, while others would not have it under any circumstances. Considering it to be dangerous and emacial alike to health and morals, we are by no means satisfied that membership is either an undistinguished blessing or an unlimited curse, for there are so many things to be considered in regard to that, and any harsh or absolute judgment of this kind would be most improper. When asked to consider whether mediumship is a thing to be sought for, and an experience that is calculated to benefit all individuals, our judgment is clear and decided. It is not a thing to be sought for, and it cannot always be considered a blessing to the person who experiences it. Be natural. It must always be borne in mind that those characteristics of your life's expressions that are spontaneously made manifest are the best for you in their expressions, and in their result, all those expressions that have to be forced into activity and require constant nursing and care to maintain in operation, until such drains upon the body, mind, and spirit that they are very questionable benefits to you in the end. When mediumship comes or expresses itself spontaneously, manifesting itself by reason of its own inherent power, then there can be no question that rightly used, and with proper and rational limits, the exercise of mediumship can be made a means of great blessing to the individual, not only to the individual, but by the community as well. Mediumship must be accepted then as an illustration of latent possibilities within the character of the medium, and as another avenue towards the occult side of life. But the persistent effort to cultivate mediumship or to force it into activity should always be discouraged and discontinued. There are so many other things, so far as the practical necessities of human life are concerned, that press thick and fast upon you, upon every side for attention in doing that. In our judgment, in the consistent condition of human development and human society, it is better to attend to the pressing needs of the world's life, education, and development than to squander precious powers and energies in order to develop a flower that, perchance, may bloom a little season, and then wither and die, leaving scarcely a memory of its hue and fragrance behind it. Mediumship and health. The first thought we have to consider in relation to mediumship is its physiological conditions. There are two kinds of strictly nervous and strictly physical. It is at first instance we consider the highest degree of physical health perfectly compatible with the very best manifestation of mediumship, and where mediumship results in personal deterioration or the destruction of physical health, then it is most unwise and extremely pernicious to continue and utilize such part of your nature, because it empathetically means that such part is being exercised at the expense of other powers. Therefore, the first caution we would suggest that whenever and wherever the exercise or development of mediumship results in continued ill health, it is wisest and safest to abandon its exercise, because it is maintained at the expense and injury of your physical well-being. Our ground is strong and sure here. Physical health is one of the most greatest blessings that infinite intelligence has rendered possible for finite humanity. It is far too precious a thing to be cast lightly aside or trampled beneath your feet. But distinctly understand what we mean by physical health. It is this, that personal consideration where all functions of the body are in natural, normous, and harmonious operation, wherein you are sound in womb and limb, to use a homely expression. The mediumship continually lessens the functional activities of your nature, then empathetically an injury is being done to you. At first, almost involuntarily. At first, almost invulnerably, mediumship in its early stages will result in severe physiological derangement, nervous prostration, and many altogether strange experiences in body and mind, which frequently cause to frighten beholders to believe that the individual is surely going out of his mind. Nothing of the sort. If the judicious care be exercised in the earliest stages, the resulting disturbances may be successfully overcome and reduced to order. Harmony being re-established, such extreme disturbances will be very unlikely to reoccur again. The causes of these physiological disturbances are various. Mediumship stimulates the body. All people are born with certain tendencies and with certain weak spots in their physiological natures, and whatever physical power descends upon them will most certainly search out that weak spot first, because there will be in the line of at least resistance, and that being the first disturbance will be manifest in that direction. Is the heart weak in its action? Is there weakness in its circulatory system? Then the result of the influx of psychic power will be to affect the affections of the heart circulatory system. While as concerning the brain, it may be that some particular part of the cerebral structure may be stimulated into abnormal activity, and people may suppose, when they know no better, that mediumship has unhinged the person's mind and affected his brain, whereas the real fact is that the possibilities of the affection existed prior to the development of the mediumship, and the development of the mediumship has only brought to the surface the latent possibilities. Here is a most important lesson. If the influx of psychological power in the development of what is called mediumship results in making plain the weak spots of the psychology, then the information thus presented should be utilized so that you be taught to direct your mind to the building up, strengthening, and rounding of these weaker parts, that they may come into the fine of general health with the reminder of the system. There is another side to this psychological aspect of mediumship. It occasionally acts in such a manner that it becomes a stimulant to every organ and function of the system, and the individual becomes excited, nervous, or irritable, so that people say development of mediumship is just burning that man right up. This is true, for the functions of his bodily existence are all so accelerated that though he eats and drinks as usual, he appears to get no benefit therefrom. The fact being that he really is wasting away, because the great stimulus that has fallen upon him is exhausting his vitality quicker than it can be recuperated. Here then must be laid down the law. The greater the acceleration of psychological function as the result of physical influences upon the human body, the more need of caution and restraint in every department of psychological life. Thus the lesson is clearly borne upon him that under no circumstances can you afford to allow the functions of the body to be your master, and if you feel physical nature is gaining the mastery over you, then plant your foot firmly and say, I will be the master of myself. It helps to self-mastery. Viewed from the psychological standpoint, the results of the development of mediumship are of two characters. If on the one hand it is judiciously prosecuted and applied, it results in the improvement of the entire psychology, in the building up ultimately of its weak parts, strengthening and sustaining them, and imparting a degree of excellence of operation and a healthy character to the entire body of that individual had perhaps previously been a stranger to. Much depends upon the means that are used in order to produce these results. Indeed, so many things are involved in it that it requires the greatest care in the development of medium to lead up to the results just mentioned. On the other hand, if the vital powers are depleted, the great organs of the body deprived of their necessary vital power, their magnetic and spiritual influence is drained out and exhausted, and they become torpid and congested, so that they do not fulfill their functions, then the truth is presented that the mediumship does develop a class of poor, hollowed voice and pale-faced creatures that the world calls mediums, people, in fact, who never ought to have had anything to do with mediumship. But there is no real reason why such results should be presented. The only reason for such results is ignorance and the injudicious use of these powers. How to utilize this mediumship properly does not come before us in this lecture. We are only dealing at this point with the psychological peculiarities that are associated with mediumship in regard to health and the general character of the functional operations of the system. We must now then take another step and consider it from the interior point of view, for what we have already dealt with are purely matters that lie in the external. When we go beneath the outward operations of the system, we come in contact with, respectively, the muscular and nervous forces of the psychology. These muscular and nervous forces fulfill important functions, as of course you know, in regard to the bodily or animal existence, and the development of mediumship will disturb them by stimulating and exciting them, because the unfoldment of mediumship in every case purposes and implies the absorption of a foreign spiritual and magnetic element, a quickening force. The doctrine of the Holy Ghost descending upon you is quite as fictitious as some hard-headed people would have you believe nowadays. There is a spiritual force directed by the attendant spirits that is brought to bear upon the developing medium, that, as it were, insinuates itself into the muscular and nervous forces of the subject, and necessarily stimulates and sometimes irritates these two departments, and by that stimulation and irritation leads to a cerebral excitement, which may rest within the brain simply in the external sphere, or may proceed into the interior spiritual nature, and there produce other results upon the higher planes of mediumship. Now this agitation of muscular and nervous force will be attended by a more conspicuous development of the mentality of the individual than has been induced hereafter. Therefore, working up towards the sphere of the mind and the will, all kinds of ideas, all kinds of thoughts, speculations may pass before the inner eye of the mind. Physical reaction to the spirit. Here we are trying to draw the line between the psychological and the mental department of the subject. Before we enter into that mental department, let us consider the psychological in another direction. The psychological development of mediumship may result in the development of mediumship, which is solely related to external phenomena, to those phenomena which transpire outside of the personality of the medium, but yet are dependent upon the persistence of the medium in sentence with physical mediumship. There we have, first, visible phenomena associated with mental and muscular susceptibility, which gave you those effects which are related to the personal of the medium and depend upon the functions of the medium, since they take place within the personal sphere of the medium. Here we have impersonation, those manifestations of individual possession, as they are called, whereby you are able more or less distinctly to individualize the communication of intelligence. Now this phase of mediumship is the most valuable phase of mediumship you can cultivate, and for these reasons, briefly, you may have the most remarkable phenomenon produced by the spiritual world. For your edification and instruction and spiritualists, you may be benefited and blessed as a consequence, but the spiritual world owes a duty to the spectacle world, as well as to the spiritualistic world. Spiritualists have crossed the threshold and come into the temple and are enjoying all the benefits and blessings therefore to be found, but the inquirer is within the sacred precinct. He would like to enter, yet he fears he may find no means to enable him to do so, but when by the aid of their personating medium he is enabled to see the beloved friends, and they make themselves actual and visible in the personality of the medium, plain to his consciousness and understanding, and tell him specifically points and facts of their identity and experiences that were utterly beyond the power of any other intelligence to tell. Then he has something borne in upon him through the senses of sight, of hearing, and understanding that appeals to him without any of the appearances of jugglery and conjuring that other forms and manifestations from the spiritual world naturally suggest to the prejudiced and hostile inquirer. Therefore, we repeat that the personicating medium is one of the most valuable mediums you can present to the inquirers. We know that in making this statement we are opening to considerable criticism, but we still adhere to it, and reiterate that the phase of mediumship we have referred to appeals in the deepest and clearest manner to the inquirer of any phase of mediumship that can be mentioned. We assert here what we have the most useful form of psychological mediumship, and when the individual is thus controlled, the purely muscular and mental nervous forces are being used by the operating spirits, and if those forces are judiciously used and proper attention is paid to them, and the necessary period for operation that should always follow every exercise of mediumistic gifts or powers is allowed, the individual will not then experience any very serious disadvantage from the prosecution of his mediumship. But if mediumship is pursued day after day without any attention or consideration being bestowed upon the bodily system, and without any attention to the laws of physical recuperation, then mental disaster and physical distress and inharmony will result in every case of the outward plane. Factors in mental mediumship. We now take a step from the psychological side to the more interior department of the mental state. The mental character of the mediumship is not sufficiently understood by the spiritualist at large. A great many things are expected of the mental development of the mediumship that are practically impossible in the great majority of cases, while a great many things that appear to belong to mediumship in the mental departments are attributed to spirits which do not really belong to them in the first place. There are three factors concerned in this kind of mediumship: the spirit controlling the mental atmosphere and characteristics of the medium controlled, and the mental atmosphere of the people constituting the company surrounding the medium when he is controlled. There are three very important points, and much of the confusion, doubt, and difficulty that has best the pathway of mediumship and its mental development should have been cheered up and revealed by the understanding of the two factors. The mental atmosphere of the medium and that of the sitters we are leaving, of course, now all consideration of what are called test controls, for they really come practically within the lines of consideration we have formerly mentioned. We shall have to deal hereafter with the mental characterization and the operation of spirits from the spiritual world and its effects upon the subject, and the reactionary results of that effect as an infection medium and the control. Innate and latent facility. Experimental observation shows us that there is proceeding from every individual a certain mental atmosphere, that if this mental atmosphere contains or compromises within itself is made up, in fact, of the mental and intellectual life of the individuals tinged, colored and characterized by all the thoughts, education, experiences, reflections, and mental observations of the individual. It contains within himself to all the potencies that were born with the individual, and these have to be seriously reckoned with by the spirit world. For instance, a certain manner of living inclines an individual to certain forms of thought, when by natural inheritance and disposition he is inclined to thought in another direction, but the overwhelming influence or temporary circumstance binds down the latent thoughts, crushes it in fact, and prevents its expression. When a spirit encounters a mind thus situated, it is more likely than the spirit thought, descending upon the mentality of medium, piercing and penetrating the conventional acquisitions, will go right down to the bottom, so to speak, and touch the inherited tendencies, and quicken them into life, and stimulate them into action, and so control the operation of that mentality that seemingly a new mental character will be developed as a consequence of the unfoldment of mediumship upon the mental side. Then, if you are unacquainted with the process we have just referred to and to the circumstances belonging to it, we will say the medium has embodied the mind of the spirit and became like the forces controlling him. Whereas the real fact is that the spirit influx has quickened the latent possibilities of the medium's mentality and brought it into active operation. The ground must be cleared before planting. Now this may be advantage or disadvantage, generally speaking. It is disadvantage for this reason. Nearly all the inherited experiences that you receive by birth are upon certain general lines, general finds of ignorance concerning spiritual matters. Then if the spirit world, by the aid of the mental side of mediumship, empowers to give correct interpretations of the mortal world, it is absolutely necessary that all old and erroneous opinions inherited by the medium shall be driven out, so that the mind may be clear. A practical illustration will make this matter more intellectual to you. When our medium was first developed, he was precisely in the conditions we have just referred to. The circumstances of conventional life had forced his mind in a certain direction, but inherently the character of his mind was quite different. It had inherited a somewhat religious inclination and direction, and somewhat of spiritual feeling or character, mainly of what might be called the ordinary orthodox conventional Christian form. But when the spiritual influx affected his mental sphere, it had to penetrate the two conditions, the conventional opinions in which he had been trained, and then reach down to the inherited tendency that was underneath. His whole character had an orthodox tint or hue, and he would tell you that when he first realized mediumship, it was to him something of an orthodox religious character, as he understood it, and he felt that at last he was going to become a good Christian. But having stimulated these latent errors of the mind into action, we, by due justice process, gradually ejected them, and at last cleared the mind of the residue we found at the bottom of it. And then, having cleared the mentality, we were free to train his mind in the direction of the larger and wider ideas that we have empowered to express to humanity for so many years past. Natural aptitude regulates results. When the mental sphere has been purified, much will depend upon the character of the mind, as to what use can be made of it. In some cases it becomes clairvoyant perception, in other cases it becomes inspirational. Then there is an intuitive comprehension of spiritual principles, which descending into the mind stimulates it into activity, and enables it to intellectually express in glowing and beautiful phraseology the principles of the universe, of like and being, in other cases there being organic and physiological susceptibility to entrancement. The individual becomes a trance medium through whom individual spirits may express themselves, or through whom certain particular spirits or a particular spirit may continue to manifest for lengths of years for the purpose of exalting training and teaching humanity at large. Thus you see there is the same breaking up process, the same stimulating and purifying process taking place in the mental sphere when the mediumistic development reaches the department, as have taken place in the psychological department. The result in both cases where the mediumship is judiciously developed and carefully prosecuted is the establishment of mental harmony, order, peace, and stability, as well as physical healthfulness. And those ought to be the results of every properly and orderly development of mediumship. One stage further remains in our consideration, which is the spiritual side of the question. Here we have to consider two important things. First, the effect of the mediumship upon the spiritual body, and secondly, its effect upon the spirit itself, the essential me. The effect of the spiritual side of mediumship must be the continuation of its development from the mental sphere to the spiritual brain, from the external side to the internal side. If the spiritual consciousness is to be reached, it can only be through the spiritual organism, just as the mental consciousness is reached through the physical organism. The spiritual body is the intermediate. Then we have to bear in mind that the spiritual organization is a fact in existence now, and is being elaborated by the human body while it is living here in this world. That it is the intermediate condition between the outer body, which is related to the external worlds, and the innermost of you, your essential nature, which is related to the inner world of everlasting being. It is, as it were, the body of the soul, even as the physical body is the outer envelope of your present being. This inner body duplicates the outer one, and the effects that are possible with the outer body upon the external plane are possible with the inner body upon the inner plane. And when you can stimulate these latent subject possibilities into operation, you are getting on that road which takes you out of the mediumship and brings you into the department where the individual exercises of your own powers becomes a possibility to you. For we may now tell you that the true cultivation of mediumship is a stepping stone to the exercise of your own spiritual powers, where it goes on always being mediumship, where the individual is always the subject of a dominant controlling power. The day of tutelage is individually prolonged, and no real advantage in this individual occurs. But when you can go progressively forward and reach that spiritual consciousness of the existence of the powers belonging to you in your own spirit, and can learn how to utilize and then project them through their counterparts in the material body, you open the door of the occult for yourself and are able to perform these marvelous and being able to intermit yourself into the spiritual state you can express through the outer life of what you gather therein. Mediumship, a stage towards spiritual companionship. Mediumship, then, is a tutelage that leads you forward from the recognition of the fact that there are possibilities in you that others can utilize to the understanding of the greater fact that you can utilize these possibilities for yourself. Mediumship, if you will, foster inertia and follow it intelligently with at least place and key in your hands, and then begin and benefit intelligences of the spiritual world will say to you, my brother or my sister, Open thou gate for thyself, we will be there to help you and to aid you, now that you have reached to the point where you are capable of walking alone. You have taken the first 2 steps in due and proper forward. We have led you forward, we have opened the veils 1 and 2 for you, and now here stands the 3rd already parted. Take thou this step with earnest heart and hand and steady foot. We'll help you and lead you. By now your day of tutelage is almost done, and you can stand crowned with the glory and consciousness of individual culture, and mysterious they are carried of the subject realm are open to you. Ah, some will say, that is all very well. But we will see mediums utterly oblivious to all this, who have no other thought of the value of mediumship than the material wealth they can accumulate by its exercise, and who will degrade the higher facilities you are referring to, by stultifying them to their unworthy purposes, by pardoning to ignorance, and generally doing their very best to degrade the very exalted functions they fulfill. Ignorance is the mother of many ambitions, and ignorance is responsible here, for true knowledge never beatitizes divine realities of its possibilities, nor disgraces the functions with which it is bound up by development and education. The wonderful field opened up. Briefly then, very briefly, and all imperfectly, we are fain to confess, we have passed in the review before you the psychological, mental, and spiritual developments pertaining to the unfoldment of mediumship, and we have reached the last great conclusion that mediumship leads on to a recognition of the added ship, so to speak, the personal practical knowledge of how to utilize your interior latent spiritual powers, and when you have attained this plane of spiritual development, you are in harmony with wise and thoughtful intelligences, and may be by them inspired. By that inspiration, your mind will be illuminated and your soul expanded, and you can stand up firmly, consciously, in reality of presence of the angels, for their thoughts will filter into yours, and your being will thrill the spiritual forces, and you will be rounded, developed, and strengthened in character and nature, and you can become a healer, a helper, a teacher of the world, aided by the powers of the immortal life that shall work within you. And in all such exercises find perfect health of body, perfect soundness of mind, perfect purity of moral nature, perfect cleanliness of soul. There are sure and certain reserves that shall crown your efforts as you march up through the pathways of mediumship into the better and more delightful ways of true spiritual growth and unfoldment. Here then, let us pause. Remember all we have said. Take its cautionary parts dearly to your judgment of understanding. Remember, in every case that successes entails efforts, for something will always have to be given or done. If something is desired in return, there is no royal road. The greatest warning we can give you is that in no case should this mediumistic development unboundly be sought, but wherever it is spontaneously and naturally presents itself, then carefully pursue it and apply the experiences and knowledge thus obtained to assist you in making greater advancement and further advantage as you proceed upon the road of personal unfoldment. As we have often said before, it is better to perform the humblest and most menial tasks of life successfully and be a benefit to the world than waste your time in unwise endeavors and develop occult possibilities in your natures. When you present mortal conditions, allow you scarcely any possibility of either success or usefulness therein.